Mountains are our next challenge. Mountains are created in a variety of ways, but one of the more common ways is by plate tectonics. When the continental plates collide, layers of rock are thrust upward to form mountains. This is where they get their layered angular shape. As a mountain ages, its appearance can be modified by erosion and a number of other geological processes, making them smoother and more rounded. Mountain forms can be polygonal, smooth, rough, or a combination of all three. Where they're angular, they interact with light much like a cube, because they have flat faces which point toward or away from the light source. Where they're smooth, they behave more like a composite of lumpy spheres and cylinders. Like clouds, mountains are also fractals. The repeating shapes form peaks. Each peak is divided into a shadow side and a highlight side. So this is a really good example of a peak. This is the Matterhorn, and you can see the light is coming from over on this side, and the peak is kind of divided here because it's got kind of these two faces. And this face is the highlight side, and you can see the snow on the highlight side is a bright white. On the shadow side, it's a cooler white. It's a color that's reflected off of the sky, so sunlight's bouncing off of the atmosphere in the sky and hitting the mountain. And if we want to take a look at those colors, we can see we can sample the highlight side. We get a kind of warm, kind of off-white, almost white cream color. And if we sample the snow on the opposite side, we get a kind of muted sky color. It's not exactly the sky color, and it's not just the sky color made a little bit lighter. It's lost intensity. It's desaturated just a little bit. And then where the mountain is not so angular, it starts to get a little more lumpy. Even when bare, a mountain's shadow side can still be influenced by the sky color, but this can vary depending on the type of environment lighting. The highlights can be pretty much any color. Typically warm colors are used, along with blues and grays. Greens can be added to represent foliage. So we have this example here. You can see there is kind of a little bit of light hitting the tips of these peaks around here, and it's some generally warm colors around here and here, but then where the shadow casts over the mountain, it's a very cool blue. And if we go ahead and we sample it a little bit, we'll see our shadows are kind of over here in the cool area. And when we go to our highlights, they're over here. They're much warmer. Another crucial aspect of making mountains look real is making them look very large and very far away. If they're painted incorrectly, they might end up looking like a big rock in the foreground. Use the following tips to add distance to your mountains. The first is adding some atmosphere, or mist, to your mountains. And if you can see on this mountain here, it's separated from the mountains that are in front of it with a little bit of mist, and there's kind of a transition from blue down to this kind of peach color that's based on this sky color here. So you'll want to do that anytime you want to try to separate layers of mountains or separate mountains from the foreground. And you can really vary this. You can see that near the light source here, everything is kind of washed out, and then as you move away from it over here, it gets kind of a little bit darker. There's a nice transition that goes to the left, a nice gradient. The next thing you'll notice is that the value is a little bit different, and if we sample a little bit here, we'll see that, for instance, this mountain in the background is a little bit lighter than the mountain that's in front of it, which gets a little bit darker in value. And then if we were to keep going into the foreground, then we'd keep getting darker and darker and darker. We only have a couple of layers of mountains here. So let's take a look at another example. You can see there's some distant hills. If we sample the most distant one, it's pretty light. The next one gets a little bit darker in value. The next one gets even darker and darker and darker and darker, and so on. Now I know in the foreground I'm sampling trees and stuff, but you get the point. The value is going to change throughout almost all of the objects in your piece. We'll take a look at one more example. The background mountains are lighter. We go into the foreground and they get darker, 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 and so on. So there's this progression. You're going to want to always have that. So when you're painting mountains, if they don't look far enough away, sample some of your sky color and paint a little sky color over it. Add some mist to it. And then the last thing that you can do is you can play with the focal depth. And so mountains that are further away, you'll want to be a little less detailed and a little simpler, more blurry. And then mountains that are in the foreground, you'll want to have a lot of really sharp texture and detail and more character to them. You know, as you can see here, this area in the foreground here has a lot of texture, whereas the area in the background here, you can't even see any of that texture because it's so small. So it kind of all blends in. And if you were to try to add in too much texture and too much detail on these background mountains, they wouldn't look distant. They would look like they're part of the foreground mountain. So there's a couple of rules you have to follow there. But once you start doing that, your mountains are going to look more realistic. Much of a mountain's character lies in its texture. In traditional painting, building up thick paint texture is very useful for achieving realistic stone effects. We can't add physical texture to our digital paintings, but we can do an excellent job of communicating it visually. Rock and stone texture is yet another fractal pattern. Texture is accomplished by using brushes which make fractals, like the sponges and chalk brushes. We can also use layer masks to simulate paint break. I'll just show you a quick example of paint break. With a palette knife and real oil paint, it's actually pretty easy to do, but in the digital art world, it's a little trickier. I'll explain how to do it in detail later, but right now I'll just kind of demonstrate what paint break is. And you can see when I paint, I don't just get a solid stroke. I get a stroke that kind of deposits a little bit of paint, but it leaves these gaps in between. That helps to really quickly flesh out mountain shapes without really having to spend a whole lot of time drawing all that detail by hand. And then you can get something that looks like a pretty convincing peak. Really put as much work into it as you want to get it looking the way you want it to. But it's pretty easy to do. Now we'll take a look at the anatomy of lakes and reflections. The water in lakes can be a variety of colors. It's often a mixture of the watercolor combined with the sky or environment colors. Nearby objects may be reflected off of the water surface as well. It's important to give your lakes a shoreline and a waterline. So a shoreline will make your water look as if it's collected in a recessed area and has an eroded surface near the water's edge. Make this a brown or tan color and use some texture to make it look distant, like dirt or stone. You can see here, right where the water meets the land, there's this nice light shoreline here, which really stands out. And the water would kind of eat away at the shore and, you know, turn it into sand and all that. So it's nice to have that there. It kind of separates it and gives it contrast, but it also makes it look more natural. And the water line you can't really see, but occasionally when the water meets the shoreline, there's a little bit of white area, something like this. And if it were brighter out or we're looking at a different picture, we might see more of a water line, but a water line kind of helps to separate things and give it movement and make it look more natural. And of course you can see a little bit of this mountain color here reflected in the water. We'll look at another example that has a little more apparent reflection. In this example here, you can really see the reflection. It's a very clear reflection. You don't really see much of the watercolor because it's really just reflecting the sky. But there's a little bit of a slightly darker tint. If we look at the overall color of the water here, it's darker in value than the sky is, even though it's reflecting basically the same colors. Reflections can be very tricky when doing a traditional painting. But in digital art, there's some shortcuts we can use to make easy reflections without having to turn our canvas upside down. Reflections are basically a mirror image of what's above the lake surface in the background. The reflection is typically mirrored at or near the composition's horizon line. So our horizon line is about here, and that's where our reflection starts to kind of mirror. You can see, especially on these trees here, it kind of mirrors. Now, the reflection does get distorted a little bit, and it doesn't have to be exactly perfect. You'll notice in this example, there's kind of a vertical kind of distortion going on here. It's making it nice and blurry, and it makes it look more like water, like there's some texture and movement in the water. The reflection's often opacity blended with the base color of the water or the sky. The amount of blending depends on the angle of view, environment lighting, and translucency of the water. Reducing the opacity of the reflection has an effect of making the water look murky. Now that we've made some observations to draw upon, we can go ahead and start our week 2 assignment, painting a mountain, a lake, and a reflection.